join us at any time, unless, of course, Rabbi Kira or Rabbi Sarah is teaching, in which case you're not allowed to join, no matter what, not at all, not acceptable. So that's just the general overview of the program in terms of how this fits into our own high holiday preparation. Just on a specific level, as we shift, and I get out of the way so that Professor Dollinger can be the one talking. Just by way of that shift, Professor Dollinger concluded last week's talk with a really powerful quote from Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. And the quote itself basically laid out the challenge that we've experienced power and we've experienced powerlessness. And the challenge is between those two, how does one actually live morally, given the challenges that having power poses for people? So with that in mind, it is a pleasure to turn things back over to Professor Mark Dollinger. Professor Dollinger, take it away.
Great to see you all again, and welcome back as I set up the PowerPoint for today. Today we are going to begin with a pop quiz for the rabbis. Now, to be fair, I have already let Rabbis Kira and Jonathan know the questions, so they've had time to contemplate it, but I want to give credit to your rabbis because I do give options to the rabbis to give them the answer first so they can look good, and both have denied the answer, so they're going to give their best shot at it as we go. And I'll also add, I don't know if you're hearing beeps, but if you are, that's just because every time someone comes in, they do. I don't know if it's possible to turn that sound off centrally, but otherwise, it just means more people are coming to learn. So we begin today in 1963 at the annual meeting of the Conservative Movement's Rabbinic Assembly. And here, as in the CCAR or RA rabbinic meetings, they always pass resolutions. Well, as they were passing the usual civil rights movement resolutions, as most Jewish organizations were in the mid-1960s, there was a group of rabbis who made a demand. They said, let's shut down our Rabbinic Assembly conference early. Let's all get on airplanes and go down to Birmingham, Alabama, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is planning a march. Because it's one thing to pass a resolution, it's another thing to be with him in the streets marching. Well, they didn't actually shut down the meeting, but about a dozen conservative movement rabbis, all men in those days, did get on planes and they went down to Birmingham. One of them was Rabbi Richard Winograd, who was the interim director of the University of Chicago Hillel. And for those who can get some phonetic Hebrew pronunciation, you'll see this slide is a t-shirt of the University of Chicago Hillel shirt. Well, it says Chicago if you spell it out there. So the challenge for Rabbi Winograd, though, when he landed at the airport, he was met by Southern Jews. And these Southern Jews did not support Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., or at least the public demonstrations that he was leading. And they really wanted nothing with Northern rabbis heading south. In fact, they showed up at the airport with signs that said, Yankee, go home. So when the rabbi wrote his diary about his trip, which he later published into an academic article, he wrote, I had the feeling that we somehow were the Hamans and Torquemadas to Southern Jews. Haman, of course, a reference to the Purim story. Torquemada was the chief inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition of 1492. So it's pretty clear that these Southern Jews were not welcoming these Northern rabbis, and the Northern rabbis felt the heat. So my questions, Rabbis Kira and Jonathan, if you were Rabbi Richard Winograd from the University of Chicago Hillel, standing at the Birmingham airport in 1963, greeted by these Southern Jews, telling you to go home, what do you say? Who wants to go first? Just unmute yourself.
Well, I'm going to try to be gracious here, and I'm going to let our guest go first.
You're going to make me go first. Okay. Thank you. What do I say to the Southern Jews telling me Yankee go home? Well, I think, speaking of being gracious, I would say, I'm here as a supporter, and I will I will stand on the side and support you and be here for you. And when you're ready to, trust me and call me in, I will be here, but I'm not going home because this is my place and this is our place, and we as Jews stand together.
All right, thank you. Rabbi Jonathan.
Well, after the highly classic rabbinic answer, I thought of another more practical, which would be Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim Chaim.
Yep.
The words of the living God. We both have different points of view. The other answer that I would give, probably, that I would suggest even, or wonder to give is, hey, can we have a drink and talk about it?
Very nice. Oh, sorry, Rabbi Jonathan, are you finished?
Yep.
For that? That's good.
That was it.
All right, so as we're continuing to go through our 4-lecture series, and thank you for playing along, because when we're meeting in person, I'm able to separate everybody so that we can get everyone to commit to what I call the correct, incorrect answer. And it's what I'm looking for. And your rabbis have indeed given the correct, incorrect answer. Thank you so much. Because what Rabbi Winograd said was, when he compared his civil rights advocacy views to the anti-civil rights views of the Southern Jews who were there, he said, from a moral point of view, the scales were very even. From a moral point of view, the scales were very even. How is it possible that someone who is opposing Jim Crow segregation and someone who is supporting Jim Crow segregation are on the same moral plane, right? That's one good question. The deeper question is, how can a rabbi, as a rabbi, have that view? And third, of all the rabbis that are going to have that kind of empathy for Southern Jewish recalcitrance on civil rights, it's literally a rabbi who left his Rabbinic Association meeting early to go to Birmingham to march with Dr. King. Well, I'll tell you, when I read this, and this was actually for my first book, when I was writing my dissertation, it stopped me in my research tracks. It became not only the answer to this, which is what I'm going to develop today, it was not only the thesis for that chapter in that book, but pretty much my career looking at Jews and politics and social justice. And last week we dealt with the challenges of powerfulness and powerlessness, and that American Jews, at least since 1945, have had experience with both. And now Rabbi Winograd is teaching us again. Here's what he wrote. I was not fully convinced that we had a right to place the Jewish community of Birmingham in a more dangerous position than we were willing and able to place ourselves, unquote. He empathized with the fact that he lived in the North, his brethren lived in the Deep South. And if you're living in the Deep South, your politics are going to be different. And that is actually, in his view, legitimate. And to the two rabbis, I'll say, here is what he pained over the most. What he pained was, quote, the circumstances which led to pitting Jew against Jew, unquote. He realized that he, as a rabbi, had divided his own community. And he understood that as a rabbi, he was in a difficult and awkward spot. He needed to have empathy for everybody in their various expressions, while at the same time he needed to advance what he believed Judaism said and what his, in this case, what his Torah thought that it taught. So what we're going to do is sort of unwind Rabbi Winograd's moment as we look at the history of the civil rights movement through the 1950s. So, oh yeah, there's my Shalom Y'all. That's my Southern Jew slide. So we're going to enjoy that. I'm going to get back to that in a moment. Welcome, great to be back for round 2 of our 4-week series as we are engaging Elul and coming with the high holidays. Today, the historical question. Oh, for those of you who missed last week, we missed you. Great to have you this week. There are going to be some times through the 4 where there'll be a little bit of repeat. And what I do is I just move as quickly as I can. I want those who weren't there previously to know what we're talking about, but I want to respect those who have already heard it. So I have a historical question that guides each talk. Today, we want to know what best explains Jewish participation in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. And the thesis I'll be arguing today, and by the way, I give all of my students a half-grade bonus if they write a paper that disagrees with the thesis I give in the lecture. I'm trying to teach critical thinking, you know. In a challenge to accepted notions of Jews and social justice. Participation in the civil rights struggles of the post-war era reflected American Jews' movement into the mainstream, more than it revealed heroic selflessness. That said, the very few Jews who risked power and privilege for the benefit of African Americans, and we know that many did, and several, sadly gave their lives for it, they emerged as heroes, though most of their brethren remained on the sidelines of activism. And this is going to be part of the dynamic. We're going to look at different groups of American Jews and how different groups responded in different ways, and try to create space for all of those different sorts of reactions. So if we're going in what was for me, Camp Swig, Camp Newman, Camp Ramah, kind of Jewish educational setting, at the end of this lecture, you should be able to describe Jewish involvement in civil rights in both the North and South and the North, compare and contrast the rationales for Jewish participation in those regions, and then assess the limits and possibilities of Jewish social justice in the 50s and 60s. What we try to do is spiral the curriculum. So number one is the easiest thing to do. It's a little harder to compare and contrast. Assessing limits and possibilities, that's the hardest of all. So for our former history majors amongst us, here is a very easy question, and that is to define history. In fact, we can be gendered because up until about the 1970s, it was his story, until second wave feminism brought gender in. That said, this is the easy question. History is the study of the past. That's just the lead-in for the polysybolic, or as the late Rabbi Professor Michael Signer, who used to teach at HUC in LA, liked to say, why use a monosyllabic when a polysyllabic will do? So I try to keep that. The word here is historiography. And if you're a former history major and you're watching with somebody else and you know the answer, you could let them know. You're going to look really impressive in a moment. I'm circling this word graph. Graph means to write. And historiography is the history of historical writing. Because it turns out that every 20 years or so, or however long a generation is in academia, a new group of scholars will look at the same moment in history and write about it differently. Because each of us, no matter how hard we try to be third person and dispassionate in our writing, are informed by all of the various things about us: our age, our gender, our race, ethnicity, religion, whatever identity marker you like. And we do have peer review, and we do have reviews in journals and such. But fundamentally, if you were to look at history, any particular topic, you would see that generation to generation, it's written differently. So historiography is the study of how historians have studied the past. This is a picture of the late Professor Joyce Appleby of blessed memory. She was my very first grad school professor at UCLA. And she was also the president for a time of the American Historical Association, the professional group for all history professors in the country. And she taught us the first week of grad school, history is more the study of the present's relationship to the past than the past itself. That when you hear a history lecture, and certainly a university level one, what you are hearing is as much the current against the past as any kind of notion of a dispassionate past. So this is my favorite polysyllabic. The word is filiopietistic. Anyone? I'll give you a hint. It's from the Latin. Okay, so piety, love, filio, brother or family. Filiopietistic is love of one's own family. In academia, we call it ethnic self-congratulations. And in Jewish studies, we call it, aren't the Jews great? Aren't we great? I know we're great. Do you know how great we are? Every 3 weeks, I get an email that gives me a list of all the Jewish Nobel Prize winners. Well, so here's how filiopietism, note a different use of the word, operates in academia. The first generation of historical writing of any ethnic, racial, gender group tends to be filiopietistic. It means it tends to talk about all the wonderful contributions that that particular group made to society. So if you look, actually immigration studies was the first one in the 1950s. The first generation of books in immigration studies were all like, immigrants are great, and here's all the great stuff they did. Labor history came next. And then in the mid-60s, when Black history, Jewish studies, women's studies came in, you really need to capture your group's contribution, which means if you're a grad student and you're in the second generation and you want to get your dissertation published and everyone's already written about how great the Jews are, the second generation, they have to write how terrible the Jews are. So all the second generation book in ethnic studies are all like criticizing their group, which leads the third generation of grad students to tell their parents and grandparents in academia, don't bicker back and forth. The truth is somewhere in the middle, and then they try to find it. And then, of course, the fourth generation, they say, oh, you're asking the wrong questions. American Jewish history is really about the environment, and then they have to start all over again. So academic historians don't write history. We write historiography. So today's lecture and the ones that are going to come in the next 2 weeks are less about the history of Jews and civil rights and social justice and race. It's more about the historiography. I want to bring you along sort of on the journey of how different historians from different perspectives have viewed the same question. So I just want you to know this word filiopietistic, it's really a word, a challenge for both your rabbis. We are socially quarantined. This is actually a challenge for your congregants, not for you. I know I got a facial expression like, I don't want another challenge. You get to be the judge of your congregant challenge. You are all social distancing, I know, so you don't have normal, regular face-to-face conversations. And if you can find a way to use the phrase filiopietistic historiographic analysis in conversation, I'm going to mail you a prize. Now, you can't say, oh, we learned about filiopietistic historiographic analysis in a Zoom lecture this morning in synagogue. That would be too easy. You have to have an ongoing conversation for which the phrase filiopietistic historiographic analysis naturally flows. And when it does, email your rabbi, tell them the story, and I will get you your prize. So I use this word as much as I can because I love the word. My students at SF State, they get a prize if they can drop the word in another Jewish studies class at SF State, because all of my colleagues know about the word. And when I wrote the book Black Power, which we'll be talking about next week, I put the word filiopietistic in the book, right? Because this is it's my shtick, right? The editors came back and told me I had to get rid of it because no one would know the meaning. And I said, no, I'm sticking it in because all of my friends who read the book are going to get a laugh out of it. So I want you to know that if you go to the online dictionary and type in filiopietistic, it'll give you the definition, but it gives you a place where you can say, where did you find this word? So I looked it up, and I like to thank Virginia Spatz. I don't know Virginia, but she clearly read it, didn't know what it was, and typed it in there. So that's great. Last week, I recorded a podcast for a podcast called Jewish History Matters. And in the questioning, he used the word twice, and I thanked him off air. I said, thank you for dropping that word in, and please leave that in the final version. Okay, so now we are going to apply history and historiography to Jews in the civil rights movement. This is probably the most famous image of Black Jewish cooperation. This is, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and I think on the far left we see John Lewis, who of course we know sadly just passed away. So here's how historiography works. The question we have is, why did American Jews get involved in the civil rights movement? And I want you to know that American Jews were the largest white participants in civil rights in the US. In fact, there were many occasions when, even though Jews were just 3 or 4% of the overall population, that Jews were a majority of all of the white protesters at any given action. Schwerner and Goodman, along with Cheney, as we know, were killed by KKK members for registering voters in Mississippi in 1964. So the first generation in historiography captured the fact that American Jews were disproportionate, that there's something about Jewishness that made it different than even Christianity or even other secular Americans. Following in this historiography was the question, why did Jews get involved? Now, typically, 3 answers are given. Answer number 1, Blacks and Jews get together because they share a common history. Because of anti-Semitism, Jews know what it's like to have hardship and discrimination in their past. African Americans clearly do too. Therefore, history brings the 2 groups together. In a related way, sociology, that is the fact that Blacks and Jews both know what it is to be marginalized, brings them together. Of course, it's related to history, but if Blacks and Jews are both outsiders and both want to get access to the mainstream, Blacks fighting racism, Jews fighting anti-Semitism, the sociology of the 2 groups will bring them together. And when I have an opportunity to quiz people when we're face-to-face, most people get the history and sociology arguments, even if they don't use those words. It's the 3rd rationale that typically folks don't get, and it's the irony, because the 3rd reason is Judaism, all right? Judaism, the religion of the Jews. That Jewish text tells us we should be involved in social justice work and in civil rights. And I'm about to critique the Reform movement, and I am a Reform Jew, so I just want to let everyone know before I critique it, this is where Tikkun Olam comes in. Yes, Tikkun Olam, my 2 favorite words in the English language. And because Jews, and especially in the Reform movement, believe in Tikkun Olam, then in repairing the world, for those who haven't heard that phrase yet, then Jews should be involved. Okay, so here is what appears to be the letter Y. But in fact, if you look closely, you won't see the 25th letter of the English alphabet. Instead, you will see a visual depiction of the filiopietistic historiographic analysis which has plagued understanding of Black-Jewish relations in the post-war era. Wouldn't you agree? Oh, wait, here's some explanation. Let's put African Americans here in the upper left-hand corner, if you can see my cursor turning. Let's put white Jews over here at the top on the right. And you notice they're apart, right? But wait, look, over time, they come together into the center of the Y. This is the civil rights movement. This is King and Heschel. This is Blacks and Jews marching together just like that, right? This is the thesis of pretty much every book that came out in the first historiographic generation. Blacks and Jews are different. Blacks and Jews come together. Blacks and Jews march together. Okay. Now, the 2nd generation in the historiography, and this is where it's, all right. So a pretty smart grad student looked at the history argument for why Blacks and Jews should come together. Here's the challenge around history. Well, I'll put this in the words of an African-American colleague of mine who was a sociologist of race and ethnicity. He also happened to have been the chair of New Jersey's Black-Jewish Alliance back in the day. And for that, he got invited to a lot of Passover Seder. So he would tell me about his Passover Seder experiences. And he said, look, if another Jewish person tells me that they know what it's like to be a Black man in America because they were slaves in the land of Egypt, I'll scream, you know? And I thought that was a powerful point because the African-American experience has been one of slavery to begin with, and then quasi-slavery immediately after, and systemic racism from that. It has always been a challenge. American Jewish history, whether we start in 1654 or 1850s or the 1880s, when most American Jews today, their families started coming, it's been a really good history, and we covered that a bit last week. So the American Jewish experience had Jews moving into the middle class and into college and into good professional jobs by the 2nd, if not the 3rd generation. So the truth is, Jews helped Blacks in the civil rights movement, even though they didn't have a common history. So we need to find a new rationale for that. Number 2, sociology. By the 1950s, when Jews became most active in civil rights, This was the time Jews became most active in the white Christian middle class. This is when the suburbs opened. This is when the anti-Semitism barriers began dropping precipitously. We had a lot in 1945 and 1950. By 1960, anti-Semitism, while sporadic, was not having a sociological effect. And here's the irony. The time at which Jews joined the civil rights movement was the time at which they had achieved whiteness, as we described from last week. So in fact, the sociology argument doesn't work, because sociology would demand that only Jews as marginalized would join, yet Jews actually joined when they weren't marginal. So we need another explanation. And since I have synagogues that are both affiliated with conservative and Reform Judaism, I'll be careful with the next one. If one's religious observance, if one's Judaism, if one's, let's say, adherence to normative halakha, to Jewish law, is going to be the way you live your life, we should see that the denomination most active in civil rights are the Orthodox. Yet, the Orthodox are all but absent. Conservative movement, limited. Rabbi Richard Watergrad I talked to was conservative. Of course, Rabbi Heschel was conservative. But you should know that Rabbi Heschel was spurned by his own colleagues at the Jewish Theological Seminary for supporting civil rights and later opposing the Vietnam War. Of the denominations that were involved, it was actually the Reform movement, the least halachically observant, that was most engaged in social justice. And I know that you're recording this, I think, but it's okay, I have tenure, so I'll say the following. Most of the Jews who went south were actually Jewish people who went south, were not affiliated with Jewish organizations. They were going with secular organizations, civil rights groups, blacks groups. In fact, many of them were socialists. Some of them were even Jewish communists, and they opposed organized religion entirely. So there is an inverse relationship between level of Jewish ritual observance and participation in the civil rights movement. This means for the second generation grad students, they're in luck, right? Because they've got some good evidence that they can now try to write a new book. And here is the new book. Oh, wait, it looks like the letter X. No, yes, it is. And it's the second historiographic generation, because look what happens here. You see, the earlier books all had to end pretty much in 1964-65 with the rise of Black power. And this is when the Black-Jewish Alliance splits. But if you decided to write your history book to the current day, anytime from the 1970s onward to right now, you would see blacks here, white Jews over here, and they're apart. They come together here in the middle in the civil rights movement. Probably about 1954, which is the Montgomery bus boycott or the Brown decision. Kind of lasts until about 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, the rise of Black power, right? It's about 10 years together. And after that, Jews go in one direction, end up down here. Blacks go in another direction, end up down here, and see, they're apart. By the way, one argument here, and this is what's great, that you are all like sitting in the middle of history and historiography. And we'll get into this next week and even more in the fourth week. It's possible, with the racial reckoning going on now, that blacks and Jews are actually coming back together again. And it could be that we are going to have the grad students now who are sitting at UCLA writing their dissertations are going to try to see if they're going to do a version like this. So, so we went from the Y to the X. And now let's go back to the Southern Jews and see if we can unwind how they showed up to meet Rabbi Watergrad at the Birmingham airport, and ultimately how Rabbi Watergrad was so understanding of them. Okay, here's the historiographic problem with Southern Jews. Southern Jews, for the most part, didn't support a public civil rights movement. Some of them were supportive of the goals of the civil rights movement. They just wanted to find, quieter ways in which to do it. In fact, I'll put up the next slide here. This is a book by two Southern Jewish historians, Mark Bauman and Berkeley Kalin. Professor Kalin at Memphis State, Professor Bauman, Metropolitan College in Atlanta. And the way they wanted to capture an understanding of Southern views of civil rights was to say that the voices were quiet. And I actually published one chapter in here, which came from my first book, which is actually a bit of what we're covering today. So here's how most scholars, at least in that first historiographic generation, dealt with the South. They just ignored them because there weren't that many, and they disproved your thesis that Northern Jews were supposed to be in favor of civil rights, so therefore you just don't talk about them. Well, the second historiographic generation decided you really can't just ignore them. So what they did is they at least put in a footnote. So the text would say, American Jews supported the civil rights movement. Footnote 1, you go down. There were Southern Jews who didn't, and then you go back to the Northern story. So what I decided to do in my first book was to push the historiography by giving the same number of words to Southern Jews as I did to Northern Jews. And the truth is that some Southern Jews joined white citizens' councils and were outright racists. A lot of them, as we're going to see, were very vulnerable, as Rabbi Winograd understood. And I think that their story is far more complicated. So what I did was I wrote the first half, of course, which is the Northern Jewish story, which is the dominant story. And then I did the second half to explain how and why the Southern Jews behaved the way they did. And every single member of my doctoral committee rejected my chapter. It's not a good day when every member of your doctoral committee rejects your chapter, but the good news was their reason why. They read the chapter and they told me I wrote in reverse, that I started with the Northerners and ended with the Southerners, and that I should actually flip it and open with the South and then end with the North. They said, first of all, your Southern part is from the 50s, your Northern part's from the 60s. You're an historian, do it in order. But the deeper argument they made is an argument I didn't recognize that I was making at the time, which is that the Southern Jewish response to civil rights was actually the model that the Northern Jews followed 10 years later. I didn't see it. I had not read it in the historiography, and sure enough, it was there. And that became sort of the next historiographic challenge to the way we understood the North. And now I'm moving Southern Jews to the center of the story. And rather than call them, racist and bigots, I am now looking at Northern Jews as actually more empathetic. And here's why. Demographics is the first reason. In Montgomery, Alabama, during this time period, there were only 1,800 Jews in a population of 134,000. In Birmingham, only 4,000 Jews in a population of 630,000. And certainly in the small town South, statistics in other places were similar. And most of these Jews in small towns in the South were engaged in business and trade. They had shops on Main Street. Economics was key to them. And guess what? If they supported the blacks in the civil rights movement, the whites would boycott, and vice versa. They, as we're going to learn now, couldn't win for losing. In fact, this is Rabbi Milton Grafman. Rabbi Grafman was from Birmingham, Alabama at the time, and he wrote that his congregants were, quote, caught in a vice between the Negroes and the whites, and he was the one who said they couldn't win for losing. And I want to pause here for a moment. Rabbi Alan Krauss of blessed memory, in 1965, for his HUC rabbinic thesis, went down to the South to do oral history interviews with Southern rabbis. Of course, the Southern rabbis were not too keen on sharing sensitive political issues with this young rabbinic student. So what Rabbi Krauss did was he made a deal that he would keep their name secret and keep their city secret until such time as there was no longer a threat to them. So when I was in the archives in Cincinnati and I read his dissertation, his rabbinic thesis, it said, Rabbi X from Community 3 said, oh, the quotes were great, but without knowing who said it and where they were, it's irrelevant to me. The good news was I was Rabbi Krauss's son's camp counselor. So he was in Jerusalem at the time on sabbatical. So I picked up something called a fax machine, which we used to use back in the day. And I sent Rabbi Krauss a fax and said, would you please release the key to me so I can write my dissertation and get it published? And he agreed. So I want to give credit to him. Sadly, he passed away far too young. The good news is his son and Mark Bauman, who you saw from Quiet Voices, took his rabbinic thesis and his manuscript in progress and were able to get it published by the University of Alabama Press. So if anyone's interested in more of these stories, send me an email or just look up Rabbi Alan Krauss on Amazon. So this is Rabbi Jacob Rothschild, of course, with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And his synagogue in Atlanta, which was just called the Temple, was bombed in October of 1958. And when they asked him about it, he said that the bombing occurred in part, quote, because I was so obviously identified with the civil rights movement. His wife, Janice, who you see here, who is still in Atlanta, she is in her 90s. And one of my great career joys was I got to present a version of this talk to her where I was able to quote her husband. This is Rabbi William Malev from Houston. That was Houston's largest conservative movement synagogue. He published the following: the rabbis have not spoken out, and to have done so would have been to invite resentment and anti-Semitism, if not indeed violence towards the Jewish community. He was none too happy with Northern Jews who were inserting themselves into the South and into local issues and not understanding the risks that it had on him and on his congregation. Rabbi Moses Lando, I couldn't find a picture of him, but I did find his synagogue. This is in Cleveland, Mississippi. He wrote that if he decided to support the civil rights movement, quote, it would have been limited to 24 hours. Because after that day, he said, I wouldn't be there in the state anymore. The Jewish community could not exist if they in any way involved in the civil movement. Well, this came to a head in the summer of 1961. A whole lot of Northern activists came south, a lot of them Jews, of course. One of them reflected, the Jews of this Mississippi town are not happy that I am here. Too many of us civil rights workers are Jews, it seems. Well, this is Rabbi Roland Gitelson, and Rabbi Gitelson was the rabbi of Temple Israel in Boston, and a whole bunch of his congregants had come down to Mississippi to register voters, and they got arrested. And they got thrown into jail at Parchman. And they're sitting in jail in Parchman, and this is before the internet, and this is before cell phones, right, and all of that stuff, if we have younger people watching. So what Rabbi Gitelson did was he gave a call to Rabbi Perry Nussbaum. Rabbi Nussbaum was the closest rabbi to the prison at Parchman in Mississippi. And he asked Rabbi Nussbaum if he would go to visit the prison, check in on the kids, as it were, send messages back and forth with their parents, who you can imagine were quite worried back at home. And Rabbi Nussbaum did this for a while until, frankly, it just got to be exhausting to handle all of this himself. So what he did is he wrote a letter to all of his colleagues in Mississippi, all the other rabbis, to say, come on over to my house, let's sit down and come up with a schedule, like an on-call schedule. So each of us will do a week. And that way we can take care of all of these of Jews who are in prison and on all of us to be able to do the rest of our lives. Well, I don't know if he was surprised to learn that the reactions from his fellow Reform rabbis was not great. Rabbi Moses Lando of Cleveland, Mississippi, condemned his colleague for violating the South's unwritten rules on the issues of race. He didn't see any reason for a meeting of rabbis. In fact, he said, he opposed any jail visitations by what he called uninvited rabbis. Uninvited means the prison warden didn't call you up and say, we need you to come here. And here was his quote, and especially with the two rabbis here, I say this just because, to give you strength. He wrote, it is your privilege to be a martyr. There are dozens of vacant pulpits. You can pick yourself up within 24 hours and leave. Can you say the same of about 1,000 Jewish families in the state? I am paid by my congregation, and as long as I eat their bread, I shall not do anything that might harm any member of my congregation without their consent, unquote. Rabbi Alan Schwartzman of Greenville, Mississippi, quote, I am wondering whether we as local rabbis would not be harming our people, our positions as rabbis in our communities, and the good work we're doing for the racial problems in Mississippi by going to bat for what he called these temporary inmates. Even those who supported Rabbi Nussbaum let him know that they understood the risk. Rabbi Sidney Goldstein of Meridian, Mississippi, blessings on you. You make me feel very proud that the rabbinate comes up with people like you. Rabbi Charles Mantonban did accept the invitation to meet, but Nussbaum canceled the meeting for lack of interest. At his own congregation, the board of directors, quote, uneasily, unquote, consented to him continuing to go to the prison, but only with the stipulation that it be done, as Nussbaum said, quote, without identification of my congregation, unquote. Several congregants registered their disapproval by resigning their memberships. Others simply went to the local sheriff. Well, civil rights movement was complex for Southern Jews. They had to balance their commitment to social justice with their fear. And if I can bring Rabbi Yitz Greenberg's quote from last week back, this is between power and powerlessness. This is the fact that as whites living in the South, they did enjoy privilege. And as Jews living in the South, they faced particular anti-Semitism, especially after Leo Frank's lynching in 1913. So for them, living in this moment, it was tough. And I'll just jump in here. This is what Rabbi Winograd saw when he saw those Southern Jews saying, Yankees go home. He understood that his political life in the North was different than the political life of the Southern Brethren, and he should not be in a position to make a moral judgment against them for it. So now we'll move north. And I would argue that in ways that we have not thought of before, and in a new historiographic approach, it turns out the North was more like the South than the North would like to think. Since most studies of the civil rights movement started in 1954 with Brown and the Montgomery bus boycott, I decided if I want to find something new, I'm going to start my research earlier. So I actually went back to 1945. I said, I'll just do post-World War II. Because between 1945 and 1954, clearly there was civil rights work going on among American Jews, but nobody was watching, because they themselves didn't know that it was how historic it would be, because they don't know what's coming with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And scholars who are studying it all begin when the civil rights movement begins. So I figured I'm going to get an edge on my colleagues, and I'm going to do something well in the historiography. And this is what I found. This quote. And I've done two things to the quote. I've taken away the author, and I've taken away the year. So we're going to sort of analyze the quote. And at the end, we're going to guess. And I didn't ask the rabbis ahead of time if they wanted to guess, and you don't have to if you don't want to, but if you'd like to, you could feel free. We'll see. Here's how it goes. A segregated system is not merely an unfair system, but it is a wasteful and inefficient system. Oh, actually, let me give you a lead in here. This is testimony to the United States Senate Subcommittee on Education on whether the federal government should pass a particular aid to education bill. So they're trying to get money to public schools from the federal government. All right, segregated system is unfair and inefficient. Nevertheless, we do not believe that a federal law to equalize educational opportunities by public subsidy, that's the funding, should be used as a means to attack the segregated school system. So long as the law guarantees that states having segregated school systems do not discriminate financially against children in the minority schools, we believe that the bill should be supported. Now, we're going to pause here a moment. I'm going to give a shout out to anyone who went to law school, and I'm sure half of you did, because I'm a former member of Dot Ariel, and my wife taught at Beth Hillel, so we're good. I will let you know that in 1954, the Brown decision passed, and the Brown decision said, separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And that's important because the Brown decision, and the lawyers here, if you're at the Friend, tell them now which Supreme Court case the Brown decision overturned. I'll give you a moment to look good. It was the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson was actually interstate rail transport. It wasn't education. But in 1896, the Supreme Court said you could have segregated overnight sleeping cars on trains. so long as you gave the black cards and the white cards equal funding. Well, of course, they never did give equal funding to the two. And what the Brown decision told us in 1954 was that even if you did, it wouldn't have mattered. So the first thing we see in this quote is a rejection of Brown and an embrace of Plessy. When it says, so long as the law guarantees that states having segregated school systems do not discriminate financially, we believe the bill should be supported. All right, so I will tell you, this was before 1954. That might be a little obvious, right? So this Brown decision hasn't come. This is embracing Plessy. So rabbis, who would have said this? Or who? I'll make it easier. Who do you think should have said this?
No idea, not even going to try.
All right, Rabbi Kira is also agreeing not to, right? So I will say somebody who supports Jim Crow is going to say this, because this is the anti-Brown decision. It's going to be a white Southern senator who is going to make sure that if a federal bill bringing money to the South to help schools is going to happen, and is not going to undo the racist system in the South. So let's look at the picture of the Southern senator who said that. Oh, there he is, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, the founder of the Free Synagogue of New York, probably the most important rabbi of his generation, personal friends of FDR, leader of the American Zionist movement, very controversial for what he did and did not do in the early days of understanding the unfolding Holocaust or Shoah going on in Europe. And when I found this, it was stunning, because this is not the Rabbi Stephen S. Wise I otherwise knew or learned. So rabbis, yes, I did set you up. That would be the incorrect answer. You're supposed to say white Southern bigoted senators, and it turns out to be one of our own rabbis. And here's the backstory on what actually happened. He went from New York down to DC to testify to the Senate committee because he wanted strong public schools. That's a very rabbinic position, and that's a Jewish position. There's nothing wrong with that. And he gave his testimony. And after he finished his testimony, the white Southern senators pulled him aside and they said, Rabbi, probably, they said, look, here's the deal. We know the moment the federal government puts money into our schools, it's going to try to deal with Jim Crow, and we won't have anything of it. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to add an amendment to this funding bill. And the amendment's going to say, you can't touch Jim Crow. Rabbi, we need you to support this amendment. And by the way, Rabbi, if you don't support this amendment, if we don't get the amendment passed, this bill isn't even going to leave this committee. The bill will never make it to the floor. The bill will never be passed. No student anywhere in the country will get a dime to support their education. Now, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise is in an impossible ethical moral position. If he agrees to the amendment, he is agreeing to codify Jim Crow segregation and ensure that black kids don't get money and only white kids do. And if he takes a moral stand by saying he disagrees with that and won't do it, no children will get money. Okay, so two things were happening here. First is what's called white liberal gradualism. That's a sociological phrase. It says that we know we can't bring all the change all at once. We are not a country of revolution, we're a country of reform. And we have to go step by step. And if he understands that step one is getting some money into some schools, and later we're going to do more money into more schools, he agreed to this gradualist approach. The second issue it brings up is, well, in 1947, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was 18 years old. Now, he was probably bright enough at 18 to have shown up there, but well, let's just for fun put him there in the room next to Rabbi Wise. And if Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was given the same deal that Rabbi Wise was, how would he have answered? I'm pretty sure he would have rejected the amendment, because if your goal is racial justice, then you need money in black schools. Therefore, what we have here now related to last week's conversation on Jews, whiteness, and privilege is that Rabbi Wise was able to enjoy the privilege of being able to agree to the amendment, even though, and this was not his desire, he didn't want to do this, but as an unintended consequence, he becomes complicit in perpetuating the racism of Jim Crow in the South. And I would, I didn't put Rabbi Winograd here with Rabbi Weiss, but I think they would actually have a lot of empathy and understanding for one another as they see how that goes. Well, in the 1950s as well, okay, here we go. Oh yes, Levittown. You can probably tell by the name. A Jewish real estate developer after World War II bought big tracts of lands outside American cities and found a really inexpensive way to build lots of houses, which are a whole lot bigger than the apartments that people who were living in urban America had. And for the first time in the 1950s, Jews had earned enough money to be able to buy into these homes. Now, as you may be aware, for a lot of American Jewish history, even if Jews had the money, they couldn't because of anti-Semitism. There were restrictions in housing covenants. When you bought a house, you were legally obligated not to sell it to a Black or a Jew. And for this reason, Jews were unable to live in places like the suburbs. Well, through the 1950s and after a Supreme Court case as well, these restrictions were removed. And now American Jews achieved part of their American dream. They got a house, they got a good quality public education, they're getting accepted by Christian neighbors, everything seems to be great. Except the racism in American suburbs didn't leave when the anti-Semitism did. In fact, for a short period of time, Jews would have had to have signed a housing covenant saying that they wouldn't sell to a Black person. And even after the Supreme Court made that illegal, there were informal ways by which African Americans were effectively kept out of what were now white suburbs, and in many cases, white Jewish suburbs. So now we have a case where Jews are entering into new social relationships, new geographies, new communities, and now they have the opportunity to see if they are going to emulate the whites-only approaches of their new neighbors, or whether they're going to be civil rights bound and to sort of do the social justice, racial equality thing. In 1951, and I like this because it's 3 years before Brown, so nobody was looking, the Anti-Defamation League did a study on just this question. They wanted to know, by the way, the 1950s was the most prolific synagogue and JCC building decade in American Jewish history. And as new JCCs were opening up in the suburbs across the country, the ADL wanted to know if they permitted Blacks. Well, half of the JCCs only admitted Jews. So with the exception if there was a Black Jew who tried to get in, I couldn't find any cases of that to see what would have happened. In half the cases, we just don't know what they would have done. But in the other half that admitted Christians, or at least didn't have a religious test to walk in the front door, half of those were racially exclusive. So half of the communities in the North became racially exclusive as their neighbors were before the Jews were allowed. Herman Kaplow from St. Louis's JCC said, JCRC said, perhaps as part of the total and gradual process of acculturation, the idea developed that it would be in the best interest of the Jewish community for Jewish centers to serve non-Jews. But they did so, he said, in most instances, following the precept of the majority community, whites only. Richard Bluestein at this time acknowledged that Jewish exclusion of Blacks in Jewish communal agencies had become, quote, increasingly acute, unquote. In Cincinnati, Mike Israel, who himself was a civil rights activist, also acknowledged, quote, there was a strong feeling that as Jews, we had enough trouble. We should not get involved in Blacks' problems. So if it wasn't history, sociology, and Judaism that brought American Jews into the civil rights movement, what was it? And for me, and through the research I just described to you, I titled my first book, Quest for Inclusion. That indeed it was the American Jewish desire to move up, to move in, to make it in America that ultimately determined their politics. That if you made it in America, in New York City as a Jew, you were going to have a New York Jewish political view based upon as much New York as anything else. And if you were in the Deep South, as Rabbi Winograd knew and understood, your political culture was going to be informed by the politics around you. And if it's true that a Jew in the North who seems to be more moral and a Jew in the South who seems to be less moral, and actually both of them are merely fulfilling their own quest for inclusion, no one has the high moral ground. In this case, sometimes it was a Jewish thing to help social justice causes. Sometimes it was a Jewish thing not to. Well, in 1964, the US Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. At the same time that the Jim Crow system officially ended, there was a surge of Black militancy, a surge in anti-Semitism in parts of the African-American community, and there was a breakup between Blacks and Jews. But to hear about Jews and the Black Power movement, I'm afraid we'll have to wait until next week.
Okay, so, wow.
Welcome, Rabbi Sarah. Sorry I didn't see Rabbi Sarah before. I had a few Rabbi shout-out moments. I'm sorry if I missed you, so good to see you.
I feel so privileged of taking this course with you, so it's not completely brand new. But I did feel guilty when I didn't answer your question about Stephen Wise, because you might have taught me that already.
Thank you.
So I think for a lot of us, that is a far more complex understanding than we've ever had to this period of time, that oftentimes we get a snippet of and often an idealized version of. So when we're hearing you talk, what I'm sort of hearing is that two things need to at least be brought to this conversation. One is a sense of the complexity of it, and another is compassion. I mean, I'm really struck by what you're talking about, and the different rabbis were empathetic and compassionate to where their co-religionists were coming from. So at this point in time, just gonna, I'm assuming, Professor Dollinger, this is our time for questions.
Absolutely.
Yes? Okay, so just to remind everyone to put the questions in the chat. Herschel's going to be filtering them and just bring them to me so we can try to get as many different questions as possible. We already have a couple. There is one that was offered, and the question is there a Kantian greater good argument to be made for Jewish involvement? Or is it that some of us can't succeed until all of us do kind of argument?
Great question. And yeah, you can make both of those arguments. And in the literature, we see both of the arguments made in what I would say positive and negative reasons, right? So we'll do positive first. Positive is, and Dr. King said this a lot, none of us are free until all of us are free. Therefore, we're all linked because our democratic rights are, our futures are intertwined. Therefore, the differences between us are less relevant than the common bonds that will drive us. And I think that was a root cause to bring in as many, in this case, white allies, Jews and others, into the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. I'll flip the other one and to be a bit more cynical and to lead us into next week. Because the cynical argument against Jewish civil rights activists is that they were white opportunists. And in fact, in this negative appraisal of Jewish involvement in the movement, Jews were only joining the civil rights movement to power their own move up the social mobility ladder. Sometimes you get the metaphor of stepping on the backs of Blacks in order to make themselves better, which is to say, on the one hand, Jews have this collective memory of, how great we were and wonderful allies we were, and we were disproportionately. And at the same time, Jews are moving up into the middle class and even into the upper class at the same time period. And for many, sort of leaving issues of race and racism behind the cities that they left when they moved to the suburbs. So the truth of the matter is we're just talking about a whole lot of different American Jews. And part of what my thesis is that you can't define any community with one name. And I'm trying in my scholarship to show how varied politics are for American Jews, how it comes from lots of different places, how each of them have their own story, what we call constructed narrative is a phrase we use in academia. And I'm really looking at the different stories of different American Jews in different times and places. So I think you'd find both of those to be true.
Okay. And another question that I wanted to ask, You made a point very early on in the beginning of your talk that you said, you may have thought Jews were motivated for this reason and for this reason and for this reason, and you knocked them all down and said, actually, the majority of the Jews who were involved were not affiliated with any organization, really, or at least not any religious organization. That wasn't where it was coming from. So I was just wondering if you could go a little bit deeper into that, because I think that's very different than the way many of us think of these things. And I'm just curious, what motivated those Jews?
That is such a great question, Rabbi, and I haven't written that book yet, and I'm not going to be the one to write the book, but if I had a graduate student, I would just read her or him what you just said and say, get to work. My answer may be mashed potatoes, which means these young kids are growing up around the dinner table and they're getting fed social justice with the mashed potatoes around the dinner table. And even if they don't go to synagogue, and even if they're not an identified Jew, there is something Jewish about how they were raised. Now, certainly in the Jewish leftist tradition, socialists, for example, were not going to synagogues, but they were highly politically engaged and they considered themselves Jews in their engagement. And a lot of them went in to fight for civil rights. So really the deeper story, what we're talking about when we're talking about that, is different complementary notions of Jewish identity in America. Mm-hmm. And I think the argument that book would say that denominational affiliation is one way to be Jewish in America. And engagement in social justice advocacy is another. And guess what? They may not actually be connected. In fact, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who is the executive director of Truah, has a great book, There Shall Be No Needy, where she completely takes apart the phrase tikkun olam to basically argue that you can't be Jewish and use phrases like tikkun olam if you don't know where the phrase came from in the text and what it actually means. This is the argument that says that Judaism, or liberal Judaism, is really the Democratic Party politics, and there's really nothing particularly Jewish about it. And she is a progressive leftist Jew and a rabbi, conservative movement ordained, and she's saying that we as Jews need to bring together that rather than just let it go. So I think it would be a great conversation and debate about what qualifies as being a Jew in America when you take a secular Jew who's never had any formal Jewish education or synagogue experience, yet their behavior in the civil rights movement is unlike any other Christian or Muslim or other white person in America.
And also just as a follow-up to that, because you noted that tikkun olam has become identified certainly within the reform movement. And it has a history, I understand, of being associated with a particular kind of politics. But as you noted, the politics are really different. So tikkun olam can be, itself is a direction, but it's not a policy statement.
Correct, yeah, tikkun olam literally to repair the world. All right, so that's a nice
different views of doing it, like the Jews in the South and the Jews in the North.
That's a nice general direction to go to repair a broken world. As one of my rabbi friends says, nowhere in the 613 commandments does it say to recycle. And that's because the bar mitzvah kid said that first mitzvah project he was going to recycle. And it's a sweet thing that the kid wants to do a recycling project. It's actually not a mitzvah. Maybe we could find something in Baal Shachit that says that recycling would be a good thing. And the message that Rabbi Jill Jacobs is teaching is that Jews, no matter their political views, if they're on the left or the right, need to take serious engagement with the text in order to make the case that they want to, because, and now I'll just generalize, we have, so American Jews, I'm not sure if I said this last week or not, American Jews are the most liberal progressive white ethnic group in America. Tends to be about 80% of American Jews will vote now for what's the Democratic Party. And that's a misnomer, because I think it's more appropriate to see us as a segmented community, which is to say that the Orthodox tend to be more politically conservative than the other denominations and to those who are not denominational. And the Orthodox are the ones who are following, halakha more than others are too. So Rabbi Jonathan, right, that would be a good case to try to figure out why there is a greater propensity of political conservatism on Orthodox when the Orthodox are the ones reading the text even more. I think that's a great question in American Jewish politics. Jews from the former Soviet Union tend to be more on the political right. And I'll tell you, I'll do a quick aside. I'm a member of Congregation Rodef Shalom in San Rafael, And my Rabbi Stacy Friedman, you know, she asked me once a year to come give a talk, right? So given my field, I always give like the politically volatile talks. Yeah. So for Martin Luther King weekend a few years ago, I'm going to do a Black Jewish talk of some sort. She calls me 2 weeks before and she said, you're not doing Blacks and Jews, you're going to do the Jews and Trump. And I'm like, no way, you know. She says, well, it turns out Inauguration Day in 2017 was on a Friday, and hours after inauguration, we're going to get like 500 people showing up, and they're going to need to hear some words. So you're going to have to say something historical. And then she lovingly said, don't piss anyone off, right? So, right. So here's what I said that night, and I want to say it, you know, to Rabbi Jonathan to bring out this point. There have never been more Jews more close to the President of the United States than now, right? The daughter, the son-in-law, and I don't think this is true, but his grandkids could call him Zadie. And while there have been Passover Seders in the White House for years, these last few years would be the first time it would actually be a family Seder going on. Now, most of American Jews are abhorrent what I just said, and probably most of you are too. But as a scholar of Jews and politics, I am really interested to understand people like Stephen Miller, right? Who is a leading policymaker on political immigration issues, who is, I think, at opposite ends of where most American Jews are politically. Yet he is also Jewish. So I get to, because I'm a professor and I'm tenured, I get to like sit with all of these thoughts and try to figure them out. So that's in a deep way what I'm trying to do. So,
okay.
Thank you.
Just to continue with the questions as they come in, many Jews own businesses in Black areas. How did this impact Black-Jewish relations?
Usually negatively. So, and of course, it all depends on who the persons are, because there's great stories and there's bad stories. But generally speaking, as we look at all of it, when Jews lived in inner cities and they owned and operated stores and apartment buildings in inner cities, and they were Jewish customers, it's all good. Then at a certain point, the Jewish families left those buildings and moved to the suburbs, but they didn't sell the buildings or sell the businesses. So now, Jewish-owned businesses are making a profit off largely Black Latinx communities. The money is now going out of the cities into the suburbs to build, let's just say, synagogues and JCCs. And now the major means of everyday face-to-face contact between Blacks and Jews is in an economic relationship. And there were, of course, some Jews who did not take good care of their apartment buildings. And then there'd be protests against what they would call Jewish slumlords. Sometimes those accusations became anti-Semitic. Sometimes they accurately reflected, but certainly they got a lot of publicity in the media, and certainly scholars have dealt with it too. So what's happening a lot now, and we'll get to this more in 2 weeks, is there is an attempt to find ways, and by the way, that's a systemic issue, right? It's like these Jewish families were just, this was their business, and they were doing their business, and this is how they made a living. But now that they've moved away from the communities, there is an unintended consequence. And that's the part of the way that systemic racism is built, because nobody can actually try to do anything wrong, yet a situation like this develops. So now they're looking for creative ways of bringing, in this case, capital back into Black communities and into inner city areas.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't actually ask this question before. I didn't see it, because it's a bit of more of a follow-up on the last question I asked. Even if many civil rights advocates came independently or through non-religious organizations, can you please talk about the organized support of the civil rights movement through the Jewish institutions?
Okay, so I want to make sure I get that question. This how Jewish organizations supported it? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Like, in other words, you've acknowledged. I think this is where the intent of the question is. We've acknowledged that, you know, the actual, you know, Jews on the ground, so to speak.
Right.
A lot of them were not affiliated or part of a religious organization. Okay. But there were religious organizations and other Jewish institutions.
Right.
That were not. So I think the question is, you know, can you just kind of broaden that, give us a sense of that a little bit more?
Yeah, across the organized Jewish world, there's strong support for civil rights movement in general and for lots of specific measures. So Rabbi Winograd that we talked about, literally at the RA convention in 1963, they had a whole conversation about whether they were even going to end it, and a dozen of them got on planes and left. The American Jewish Committee, the ADL, the American Jewish Congress, were all not only passing resolutions, they were creating civil rights social justice commissions. What was then the UAHC, now the URJ, has something called the Religious Action Center. And in fact, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was written in part in the offices of the RAC, of the Religious Action Center. So there is going to be sustained support both in resolutions, as well as in committees, as well as in political organizing, as well as in funding across the framework of secular, conservative, and reform. Occasionally in the Orthodox movement, I was able to find some resolutions in favor. In the Haredi community, in the sometimes called ultra-Orthodox community, not so much. They considered movements into civil rights to be taking away from the Jewish insularity that they were trying to create. And one more thing. For today and for the next 2 weeks, I'm approaching you historiographically, not just history, which means when I'm giving you some of the stories, I'm actually not giving you the whole story, because part of it is I'm trying to assume you have certain knowledge about Jews and civil rights, and then I'm telling you how scholars over the generations have re-looked at it to try to unwind it. So instead of sort of repeating what I think we already know, I'm just going up to challenge what you think you know, so that we can imagine things in new ways.
Okay, thank you. Also, I'm just scrolling through my chat here trying to pick up these questions. So another question, and this might tap into why we're doing historiography and not history per se, because this question, and it may come up a little bit later, is, you've talked about in your thesis is how inclusion and the desire to be included was the main motivation for Jewish involvement or lack thereof in the civil rights movement. Is there a parallel with what you see today? Is that framework that you established for the civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s, do you think that framework is relevant today? Are there other frameworks? Are there other ways, across the scholarly spectrum and ideological spectrum to address this kind of question?
That's really good. So I'll give you my joke answer first, then my serious answer. My joke answer is I'm an historian. It's tough enough to predict the past. I can't predict the present or the future. Seriously though, my career thesis is quest for inclusion. And what I do is I look at whatever time and place and try to see how those forces intersect and then how it creates whatever the political view it is. That is a dominant model. There are always cases that challenge it. For me, the definition of a hero, historically, at least in American Jewish history, is somebody who goes against the quest for inclusion and turns out to be right, because that's hard to do. Rabbi Heschel was a hero. He was a hero not just because he supported civil rights. I'm calling him a hero because he was repudiated by his own colleagues for having done it, which meant every day he did the march, he understood that he would suffer consequences as a result of doing that. And of course, now we realize he did do the right thing. So he wins the hero award. And the challenge now, and we'll get to this mostly in week 4, 2 weeks from now, is, are we in a moment where white Jews fighting systemic racism are going to take actions that work against seemingly their own inclusion? Now, you asked earlier, like, if any of us aren't free, none of us, can be redeemed. That would argue the quest for inclusion in a big way, which is everybody's included together. But sadly, the way it often works is that different groups vie against one another for what they consider to be precious resources. And if that happens, to what extent are Jews who are enjoying those resources going to reconsider and open up and do things in a different way to allow others in?
Okay, and the question is stated here as, what are Jews trying to be included in today? Just as a follow-up to that. What is that inclusion that they're moving towards?
Yeah, so I don't actually know, right? Because it's a good question. It's just too broad because there's like too many Jews. But I would just say, let's look at us individually. And like, what do we want? What do we want in our lives? What do we want for our kids? What do we want for our grandkids? You know, probably to stay healthy, to get educations, to find careers that are going to be meaningful for them. I mean, we can come up with the things that we would like and that we dream about. And what I want to do is I want to position these dreams that I'm a parent, right? That all of us who are parents have for our kids against an internal challenge with that. Because in doing what we all want to do and should do, to what extent are we now becoming a version of the Southern Jews? Or a version of the Northern Jews we just saw, or the versions of ourselves in unintended ways. So I think, as the rabbi said before, I look for compassion and openness for all of this, to hold it while we're just trying to figure out what it is we want.
Okay, and just a last question, which I think is a really, I think it's the kind of question one should always ask in a talk like this. Okay, so I've appreciated what you've said, and I think, I suspect for many of us, you know, it's a lot more different and nuanced than we were aware. And I find your argument about what really is motivating Jews about inclusion interesting. So now tell me the scholar who thinks you're totally wrong.
Right.
What is the scholar who says, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about? What does that scholar say?
Yeah. So, so in the list, so what we're going to do now is go back into the historiography. And I think you're going to find much of this in the first generation historiography. My favorite is Murray Friedman of blessed memory. Murray was a civil rights activist. He was a leader of the American Jewish Committee in Philadelphia. He also was a professor for a time at Temple University. And he wrote a book called What Went Wrong. Now, Murray was named by President Ronald Reagan to be on his Civil Rights Commission. And he was on the political right. And when I talked to Murray about this, he claimed that he was actually a registered Democrat. I said, okay, but you are actually, you know, professing what are normally seen as normative Republican Party values. And in the What Went Wrong narrative that he describes, and by the way, I'm going to be quoting from him in both of the next 2 weeks as we go forward on this, he sees a story of white Jewish heroism, risking power and privilege for the benefit of the other, which in this case would be African Americans. And he's absolutely right. And the story is correct. Mm-hmm. That said, what happened, you know, because I'm a generation younger than him, is that I read his book and I said, okay, what's a different angle, or what's one more way we can do it? Two other ideas. Berkeley Kalin and Mark Bauman, The Quiet Voices. I showed you that book cover. That's an excellent example. I will tell you that I consider my thesis very pro-Southern. You know, scholarly wise, social justice wise, even politically. I was a Yankee. I went down to Montgomery to deliver an early version of this paper. I thought they'd love me, right? They couldn't stand me. I was the worst, right? Because I apparently said bad things about Southern Jews. So I'll give you the backstory, which is that Kalin and Bauman, when they heard my paper, wanted me to publish in their book, and I sent them the paper. It wasn't Southern enough for them, and one of the two wanted to X me out, and, you know, not publish me. And then the other one said, look, we don't have to agree with everybody in our book in order to publish. So they ended up publishing it. You don't have to go buy the book and read my chapter. Go read the one paragraph in the introduction where they give you their view of what my chapter is supposed to do, and then we'll see that we vie for it. And just so you know, whenever any of us in Jewish social justice who are scholars want to publish, we're a small group and we all know each other. All of our manuscripts go to scholars at the opposite end of our political spectrum. And for one thing, it's supposed to be anonymous review, but I can tell from the comments who made those, you know, because I know who they are and I get all of theirs. And that's what we're trying to do as scholars, right? We're not here to advance particular political ideologies. We're here, my phrase is complicate the narrative and deepen learning. Complicate the narrative, which is whatever you thought before, let's think more, and deepen. Like, you're sitting here on a Sunday morning, I hope you're getting a university level lesson here. Like, I hope this is not like the usual adult ed 101 that I'm trying to do. And then I'm going to close, perhaps most controversially, but I want to say it, with a friend and colleague of mine named Ken Marcus. Ken Marcus is one of the leading scholars on American anti-Semitism. I'm teaching a course starting in 8 days at SF State on anti-Semitism. I will be using his book as my textbook. The current book I'm writing now, we don't have that lecture in here, but I'm writing a book on campus anti-Semitism. The first half at a right-wing campus, where I go against the political right. The second half of the book, when I go against the political left, when anti-Semitism happens at SF State. And Ken Marcus is going to be the guiding force intellectually for my work. And Ken, just 2 weeks ago, resigned as Undersecretary of Education with a direct report to Betsy DeVos in the Trump administration. So he is, in terms of the politics of American Jews, very far to the right. George W. Bush put him as a leader of the US Commission on Civil Rights back in the day. So as scholars, this is the community that we all are in, and we bring everyone else close, because if our job is to challenge ourselves and to be as smart as we can be, we need this variety of opinion.
Well, okay, Yasher Kah. So just one statement that I received from a congregant that I just want to share that just perfectly captures all the complexity and all the nuance. Person writes, my father was a conservative rabbi in Birmingham from 62 to 67.
Wow.
And goes on, you are correct in recognizing that many members of the congregation were concerned about civil rights workers coming down from the north. But he himself was a hero because he stood in the black line for 6 hours waiting to be registered to vote, while his congregants told him to get into the white line, which would have taken 15 minutes.
First of all, wow and thank you. If it's up to you, I don't know who said that, but if you would send me an email, if you could share that with me, I'd appreciate it. The reason I didn't have that in the talk is that the rabbinic thesis only interviewed CCAR rabbis because it was an HUC thing. And I would love more sources from the conservative movement if you would share that with me. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, we're not putting that as a way of saying a counter narrative per se, but just again, it's a subtle layer of it.
Mm-hmm.
That the heroism came up in, might not have been as explicit in some ways, but was there even in smaller ways, with people standing up for what they believed was right in lots of different manners. All right, I'm just going to scroll through. Okay, so that is at least all we have for now in terms of questions, actually, and also in terms of time. So Rabbi Dollinger, or Professor Dollinger.
I'll take smicha. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, we've got enough rabbis here. We can give you smicha if you want. But I want to thank you so much for this really fascinating, really interesting talk, really one that challenged us all, I think, on a number of different levels. And my hope as yours is that it just, whatever anyone comes up with at the end, that just makes us think and deepens what our understanding is. I think you've done that beautifully and really appreciate today's talk. So thank you so very, very much.
Thank you. See you all next week. Take care and stay healthy.
Look forward to seeing everybody next week. And yeah, 10 o'clock, we're back here.